The kitten that refused to leave. Opening. The road was empty, just pale dust, a strip of silence, and the early morning cold sitting heavy over the rocks. Officer Dana Reyes had driven this stretch 100 times. She knew every bend, every dead patch of scrub grass, every place the hills folded into shadow. Nothing out here moved fast. Nothing out here surprised you. So when she saw the shape in the road, small, motionless, right in the center of the path, she slowed without thinking, tapped the brakes, let the cruiser drift to a stop. She expected it to bolt. Whatever it was, it didn't. First contact. She stepped out slowly. Gravel shifted under her boots. The air smelled of sage and dry stone, and there it was, a kitten, tiny, sitting upright in the middle of the road like it had been waiting for something. Its fur was thick and oddly pale, not the scrappy look of a stray tabby, but dense and wild-looking, with faint dark markings running along its face, wide, flat eyes that didn't blink. She'd never seen anything quite like it. She took a slow step forward. The kitten watched her, didn't flinch, didn't flatten, just sat there, ears slightly back, reading her the same way she was reading it. She would learn later what it was, a Pallas's cat, one of the least seen wild cats on Earth, a species so secretive that most people live their whole lives without ever knowing it exists. A cat built for cold mountain terrain, for rock and silence, for disappearing. But this one wasn't disappearing. The pull. If you've ever seen a wild animal choose to stay close to a person, really choose it, without food, without a cage, you already know that something unusual is happening. This was that moment. She crouched down, kept her hands loose at her sides, said nothing. The kitten took 2 small steps toward her, then stopped, then took 2 more, not rushing, not playing, moving the way a small animal moves when it has made a decision it isn't sure it can afford to make. Careful, deliberate, aware of the risk. Dana stayed still. A few seconds passed. Then the kitten turned and walked several feet back toward the rocky hillside, stopped, looked back at her over one small shoulder. She stood up. It walked a few more steps toward the rocks, stopped again, looked back. The pattern, she told herself she was reading too much into it. Animals didn't do this. Wild animals especially, they vanished. That was the whole point of them. You caught a glimpse, a shadow at the edge of the road, and by the time you turned to look, they were already gone. She walked back toward her cruiser. The kitten followed. Tiny steps, unhurried, but steady. She stopped walking. It stopped too, sat down, watched her. She took 3 steps toward the hills. It moved ahead of her, then stopped and looked back again. She felt something shift in her chest, not quite fear, not quite understanding, something in between. She reached for her radio out of habit, then paused. What would she even say? Unease builds. She tried one more time, turned away, walked back to the patrol car, opened the door, let the engine idle. The kitten trotted after her, stopped at the edge of the road, sat down again in the dust. But this time it didn't just look at her. It turned toward the hills, held there for a long breath, then looked back at Dana again. Back and forth. Hills, Dana, hills, Dana. Something about that motion felt different from everything before it. More urgent, less like curiosity, less like an animal drawn to a stranger out of loneliness or confusion, more like communication. Wild animals do not ask for things. They do not lead people places. They do not wait by the side of a road and look at a human and then look back at something they can't reach alone. The realization. She turned off the engine. She stood there in the morning cold, looking at this small, dense-furred wild cat sitting in the dust of a back road in the middle of nowhere, with its flat amber eyes fixed on her, and she felt the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Not because she was afraid, because she understood. This kitten hadn't wandered into the road. It hadn't gotten lost. It had been out here waiting for exactly what had just happened, for someone to slow down, for someone to get out of their car, for someone to notice. She took a breath of cold morning air. The kitten was already moving, back toward the rocks, slow and deliberate, ears angled forward now, its small body low to the ground. It looked back one more time, and in that moment Dana Reyes understood something that changed everything about the next hour of her life. This kitten wasn't following her. It was leading her somewhere, and whatever was waiting at the end of that path, She was already too far in to turn back. Dana left the cruiser running. She didn't plan to go far. That's what she told herself as she stepped off the road and onto the first shelf of loose gravel, just far enough to see what the kitten was moving toward, just far enough to make sure there wasn't something dangerous up ahead that she needed to call in. Her radio crackled softly at her hip. She kept her hand near it without quite touching it. The kitten moved ahead of her at a steady pace, not running, not bounding the way a young animal plays, but walking with a low, purposeful gait, its thick tail held close to the ground. It moved like something much older than it was, like something that had learned early on that the land out here didn't forgive wasted motion. Every 15 or 20 steps it stopped and looked back at her. Every time she kept walking. The terrain changes. The road disappeared behind her faster than she expected. The gravel path gave way to raw rock, flat shelves of pale stone tilted by centuries of cold and pressure, cracked through with dark lines, scattered with low scrub that smelled of dust and something faintly mineral. The ground was uneven in the way mountain terrain always is, the kind that looks manageable from a distance and punishes you once you're in it. She watched her footing, glanced up at the kitten, watched her footing again, and then she noticed something else. The birds were gone. Out on the road there had been the usual sounds, a distant call, the dry flutter of something moving through brush. Out here there was nothing, not wind, not insects, not the shift of small animals in the rocks, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet, the kind that feels like absence. The kitten changes. She first noticed the shift about 10 minutes in. The kitten's pace had changed. It was moving faster now, not dramatically, but enough that Dana had to lengthen her own stride to keep it in sight. The pauses between lookbacks grew shorter. Its ears, which had been loosely tracking the space ahead, were now pressed slightly forward, fixed on something beyond the next rise of rock. It was focused in the way animals get focused when something matters. She'd spent enough years in this work to know that animals in distress don't behave the same as animals at rest. The behaviors are subtle, a tightness in the body, a shortened breath, a refusal to be distracted. You don't always see the distress itself, but you feel the shape of it. She was feeling it now. The sound. Then the kitten made a noise. It wasn't a meow in any domestic sense. It was something lower, softer, almost a chirp pressed through a tightened throat, repeated twice, short and urgent, the way a small animal calls when it's been separated from something and doesn't have much time left to find it. Dana stopped walking. The sound settled into the rocks and dissolved. She stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. Then she picked up her pace. There are moments in this kind of work where you stop making decisions and start just moving. Your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. This was one of those moments. The stumble. A few minutes later, the kitten stumbled. It happened quickly, a misstep on a loose stone, a small body lurching sideways, one front leg slipping off the edge of a rock shelf. It went down for just a second, chest touching stone, before it caught itself and pushed back up. It didn't stop, didn't pause to lick the leg or shake itself off the way a healthy young animal would. It just kept moving, slightly faster than before, as if the fall had reminded it of something it couldn't afford to forget. Dana felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. How long had this kitten been out here? How long had it been making its way toward the road, waiting for a car to slow down, hoping something it couldn't name would finally stop and follow? She didn't have an answer, but the question changed the way her feet moved over the rocks. Internal conflict. She checked her radio. Signal was thin but present. She keyed it briefly, gave her location as best she could, told dispatch she was on foot, following something into the hills off Miller Road. Requested a wildlife contact number if dispatch had one. Static. A half response. She caught the word copy and let it go at that. She kept moving. She was aware in the back of her mind of all the ways this could go wrong. Terrain like this had hidden dangers, unstable rock, drop-offs that didn't announce themselves, the possibility of a larger animal nearby that she hadn't seen yet. A Pallas's cat kitten this young didn't exist in the wild without a mother, and wild mothers protecting young didn't always wait quietly. Her hand drifted toward her gear again. The kitten was 40 feet ahead, picking its way through a narrow channel between two large outcroppings of stone. It turned one last time, looked directly at her, and then disappeared into the gap. The gap. Dana slowed as she approached. The opening between the rocks was narrow, wide enough for a person, barely. The stone on either side was tall and dark with moisture, draped in pale lichen. The ground dropped slightly going into a small natural hollow where the sunlight hadn't yet reached. She couldn't see more than a few feet inside. The kitten was in there somewhere. She could hear it, that low, soft sound again, different now, not calling to her anymore, calling to something else. She steadied her breath, put one hand against the cold rock wall for balance, leaned forward into the shadow, and looked down. The air inside the hollow was still and close. She could hear her own heartbeat, and then her eyes adjusted to the dark, and everything she thought she understood about the last half hour collapsed into a single quiet moment of clarity. Because lying on the floor of that hollow, half hidden beneath the overhang of stone, was not nothing, was not a den empty and cold, was not something small. Dana Reyes pressed her hand to her mouth and did not move. She didn't move for a long time. The hollow was small, maybe 8 feet across, sheltered on 3 sides by a natural curve of rock, the ceiling low enough that Dana had to tilt her head as she stepped inside. The light came in gray and thin from the gap behind her. It took her eyes a few seconds to sort out the shapes in the shadow. When they did, her breath left her. A full-grown Pallas's cat lay along the base of the far wall. Large, much larger than the kitten, with the same dense pale fur and the same flat, wide face, but built with a heaviness the kitten didn't have yet. A wild animal in full form. Under any other circumstances, in any other place, it would have been one of the rarest things Dana had ever seen. But it wasn't moving. Its side rose and fell, slowly, too slowly, in shallow, uneven breaths. Its back legs were angled wrong, not resting, not sleeping. The body was twisted in the careful, involuntary way of something that has stopped being able to choose how it lies down. Injured, badly, and she had been there for some time. Dana freezes. Dana stood completely still. One hand was still pressed to her mouth. She didn't remember putting it there. Her eyes moved over the animal slowly, taking inventory the way she'd been trained to do, cataloging what she saw without letting herself feel it yet. Shallow breathing, labored, possible internal injury, a fall from height maybe, or a collision with something she couldn't see. No visible bleeding, eyes closed. The body temperature regulation of a wild cat in this condition would be falling fast in the cold of the hollow. How long without food or water she couldn't begin to guess. She made herself breathe, and then the kitten crossed the floor of the hollow and pressed itself against its mother's side. That was the moment Dana almost lost her composure entirely. The understanding. She thought about the road, the kitten sitting in the center of it, still and patient in the morning cold. The way it had watched her step out of the cruiser, the 2 small steps forward, the long pause, the deliberate look back toward the hills. It hadn't wandered out there by accident. It hadn't been drawn by curiosity or hunger or the simple confusion of a young animal separated from its mother. It had made a decision, some version of one at least, shaped by instinct and desperation and whatever it is that keeps a living thing moving when everything around it has gone wrong. It had gone to find help, the only way it knew how. I've worked this job for 11 years. I've seen things that were hard and things that were beautiful and a few things that were both at the same time. But I had never, not once, been led somewhere by a wild animal. Never had one look at me like I was the answer to something. The kitten beside its mother. The kitten made a sound, that same low, tight chirp from the hillside, and pressed closer, its small head pushed gently against the larger animal's shoulder. The mother didn't respond, didn't open her eyes. The breathing continued, shallow and slow. The kitten pulled back slightly, looked at its mother, then looked at Dana. Just that. No drama, no sound this time. Just the simple, terrible fact of a small animal looking between the thing it loved and the only other living creature in the hollow, with no language for what it needed except presence. Dana crouched down slowly, back against the rock wall, making herself small. She didn't move closer. Getting too near would stress an injured wild animal, even an unconscious one. Elevated heart rate, disrupted breathing, the body spending what little it had left on fear instead of survival. She knew this, so she stayed where she was, and she did not leave. The call, she got her radio out again. This time she didn't let go until she had a real voice on the other end. Dispatch connected her to a wildlife rehabilitation contact, a woman named Carol, calm and methodical, who asked the right questions in the right order. Species, estimated size, breathing pattern, location. Dana answered each one, keeping her voice low and even, watching the mother's side rise and fall across the hollow. Carol told her the nearest wildlife response team was 40 minutes out, minimum. The terrain would slow them down further once they left the road. She told Dana not to touch the animal, not to offer food or water, not to make sudden movements or loud sounds. Just stay close, Carol said. Sometimes that's enough. Dana looked at the kitten still pressed against its mother's side. I know, she said quietly. The wait, 40 minutes is a long time in a cold hollow with an injured animal and no certainty about how the next hour ends. Dana watched the breathing, counted the intervals between each rise of the chest, not because counting helped, but because it gave her something to do with the part of her mind that wanted to spiral. The intervals stayed irregular, sometimes 6 seconds, sometimes closer to 10. Once, for a stretch that felt much longer than it probably was, she thought it had stopped altogether. It hadn't. The kitten didn't move from its mother's side. It groomed itself once, a brief mechanical pass of one paw over its face, then settled back into stillness. That small, ordinary act of grooming in the middle of something this large felt like the saddest thing Dana had seen all morning. She thought about her own kids, about the particular helplessness of being young and not understanding why the thing you love most has gone quiet. She pushed the thought aside, kept watching, kept counting, the eyes open. It happened without warning, the way the most important moments usually do. The mother's eyes opened, not fully, just a thin line of amber, unfocused at first, the automatic reflex of an animal surfacing briefly from somewhere very deep. Dana went completely still, stopped breathing. The eyes moved. Slowly, without any real strength behind them, they traveled across the hollow, over the stone walls, over the pale strip of light from the gap, and settled for just a moment on Dana. Dana didn't move. There was no recognition there, no fear, no trust, nothing so clear as either of those things, just awareness, the ancient, quiet awareness of a wild creature registering that it was not alone. Then the eyes shifted to the kitten, stayed there. The kitten lifted its head. For 3 or 4 seconds, nothing in the hollow moved. The cold sat still around them. The light didn't change. The world outside kept going without them. Then the mother's eyes closed again, and the breathing continued. Dana exhaled slowly. She looked at the kitten, at the slow, fragile rise and fall of the larger animal's chest, at the thin light coming through the gap in the rocks, and the shadows that were already starting to shift as the morning moved forward without them. 30 minutes, Carol had said. Maybe more. Dana pressed her back against the cold stone and did not move, because she understood now, fully, in a way that went past professional instinct and settled somewhere quieter, what was actually at stake in this hollow. If that breathing stopped before the team arrived, if the intervals stretched one time too many, the kitten that had walked all the way to a road to find help would have no one left to come home to. She heard them before she saw them, voices low and careful coming down through the rocks. The sound of boots on stone, deliberate, measured steps, the kind trained people use when they don't know what they're walking into. Then a beam of light sweeping the gap, and a face appearing at the entrance to the hollow. A young man in a gray jacket with a wildlife rehabilitation patch on the shoulder. Behind him, a woman carrying a soft-sided transport case and a folded thermal blanket. They both stopped when they saw the mother, took in the scene quietly. Dana against the wall, the kitten pressed to the larger animal's side, the shallow and still uneven breathing. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the woman nodded once at Dana, the way people nod when words would take too long, and crouched down to begin her assessment. The extraction. What followed was slow and careful and, in its own way, its own kind of remarkable. The team worked without unnecessary sound, gloves on, hands moving with the particular economy of people who have done hard things enough times to stop being theatrical about them. The woman, Dana learned her name was Petra, ran her hands along the mother's spine and hindquarters in a series of gentle passes, checking for the locations and severity of what she already suspected. Possible pelvic fracture, soft tissue damage along the left flank, dehydration that had likely been building for 2 days, maybe 3. Treatable, possibly. With time and the right conditions. Not certain, but possible. That word, possible, settled into Dana like something warm. The kitten did not leave during any of it. It retreated to the far side of the hollow when the strangers first entered, crouching low, ears flat, watching. But it didn't bolt through the gap, didn't vanish into the rocks the way every survival instinct it had must have been telling it to. It stayed within sight of its mother the entire time, still and watchful, as if it understood on some level that these hands moving over the larger animal were not a threat, or perhaps it had simply used up its fear getting here. Dana steps back. Dana moved outside the hollow to give the team room to work. She sat on a flat shelf of rock just beyond the gap and looked out at the hills. The morning had fully arrived by now, the light no longer gray and tentative but clear and low, the kind that makes the landscape look like it was placed there deliberately. Somewhere far below she could see the pale line of the road and the dark shape of her cruiser still idling where she'd left it. She thought about the drive in that morning, the way the road had looked like every other morning, the way her mind had been already halfway to the next thing when she'd seen that small shape sitting in the middle of the path. What if she'd been going a little faster? What if the radio had been louder, her attention pulled somewhere else for 30 more seconds? She let the thought settle and then set it aside. She'd stopped. That was the part that mattered. I've thought about that morning a lot since then, not because it was dramatic. It wasn't, not really, not after the first few minutes, but because of what it asked of me. It asked me to slow down, to follow something I didn't understand yet, to stay in a cold, dark place and do nothing except refuse to leave, and somehow that was enough. Days later, the mother survived the transport. That was the first thing Petra told Dana when she called 3 days later. Not she's going to be fine or everything worked out, because those things weren't certain yet, and Petra was not the kind of person who said things she didn't know. But she had survived the transport. She was stable. She was eating, a little, carefully, the way injured animals eat when the body is beginning to remember that it wants to keep going. The kitten had been kept close throughout. Separate enclosure, adjacent space, close enough for scent and sound, far enough to keep both animals calm while the mother healed. Petra said the kitten had been restless the first night, pacing the perimeter of its space, stopping, starting again. By the second day it had settled. By the third it was sleeping through the night. Animals, Petra said, often know more about how the other one is doing than we give them credit for. The visit. Dana drove out to the center on a Tuesday afternoon, on her day off. She didn't go inside the enclosure area. That wasn't appropriate, and she didn't ask. But Petra walked her to a window that looked into the recovery space, and Dana stood there for a while with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the mother lying in a low, heated shelter, and the kitten curled 2 feet away. The mother's breathing was even now. Both animals were still in the particular way that healthy animals are still, not collapsed, not conserving, but resting. The difference was visible if you knew what to look for. Dana knew. She didn't say anything, neither did Petra. After a few minutes Dana nodded, thanked her and walked back to her car. The release. Weeks passed. The mother's recovery was slow and not without setbacks. There were 2 difficult days in the 3rd week when the outcome felt uncertain again, but she came through them. By the end of the 4th week she was moving under her own power. By the 5th she was ready. Dana wasn't there for the release. Wildlife releases don't work that way. The fewer people present, the better. The animals need the landscape back, not an audience. She understood this. Petra sent her a short message that evening. 2 sentences. The mother had walked out of the carrier without hesitation. The kitten had followed. The road again. About 3 weeks after that, Dana was back on patrol. Same route, same pale dust, same hills, same morning quiet. She wasn't thinking about it specifically. The mind doesn't always give you warning before it brings you back to something. She just found herself slowing down as she reached the stretch of road near Miller Creek, the way you slow without knowing why near a place that changed you. She almost didn't stop, then she did. She stepped out of the cruiser, stood in the cold morning air and looked toward the hills. The rocks were the same, the silence was the same, nothing moved. And then at the edge of the outcropping, barely visible, just a shape against the stone, something appeared, smaller than before, or maybe the same size. It was hard to tell at distance. It sat there for a moment, watching her with those wide, flat eyes, still, unhurried, the thick fur catching the low morning light. Then, without any particular urgency, it turned and slipped back into the rocks and was gone. Dana stood there a moment longer. The road was empty in both directions. The hills were quiet. She got back in her cruiser and sat with the engine running, her hands loose in her lap, looking at the place where the kitten had been. She thought about what it had taken for that small animal to walk to a road it had no reason to trust, and wait for a car it had no way to predict, and lead a stranger across a mile of mountain terrain towards something it had no language to explain. She thought about how close she had come to not stopping, how thin the margin was between one morning and a completely different one, and she thought about all the things in a life that ask for exactly that. Not courage, not strength, not any of the large words people use when they're trying to make something sound important. Just the willingness to slow down, to follow something you don't fully understand, to stay. Sometimes help doesn't come when you call for it. Sometimes it comes when someone knows exactly where to lead you. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, you realize that you were the one being led all along.